Right, just to start off, so just to introduce ourselves very quickly to say why we're here talking around the procurement front, and Russell very kindly mentioned us right at the start of the session. So we're Procure Plus, we're a not-for-commercial profit organisation who basically puts routes to market in place for social housing providers. So frameworks, dynamic purchasing systems, different routes. And basically we do around 600 call-offs a year, so understanding how to get the best out of the market and how that works. So really today we wanted to talk about our experiences and our learning from that. So we could have jumped in and the implications of AI straight away, but in the procurement sector, at the moment, all talk seems to be around the Procurement Act, which is a new piece of legislation that's come in last year. So I thought to start us off, we'll just talk a little bit around the Procurement Act in particular and the implications to direct labour organisations, so you can give that as a bit of an understanding. And then, so Claire's going to cover that off, and then I'm going to talk a little bit around what are we seeing from the market, what sort of AI are we seeing from the market, and what's going on and what would be useful for you to be aware of. So I'll hand you over to Claire, who's going to talk on the Procurement Act.
Thank you, Matt. Hi everyone, it's really nice to be with you here today. As Matt says, my name is Claire and I'm the procurement lead here at Procure Plus, and in the next few slides I'm going to give an overview of some of the key changes to procurement legislation and also hopefully highlight some considerations and food for thought in respect of procurement activity that takes place within repair teams in the social housing sector. So you may already be aware, but just for context, on the 24th of February this year, the procurement legislation in the UK changed when the Procurement Act 2023 came into effect. The Procurement Act 2023 is a piece of legislation that is a product of the UK's exit from the European Union. And prior to the 24th of February, the main pieces of procurement law in this country came from the European directives. The piece of legislation that was the most relevant and most commonly used in the social housing sector was the Public Contract Regulations 2015. This piece of law was used for the award of contracts for general goods, works and services, and there was also legislation on our statute books that came from the European directives that governed the award of contracts in the defence and security sector, procurement in the utilities sector and concession contracts too. And the Procurement Act consolidated all these pieces of legislation into a single law. So procurement legislation must be followed by organisations that meet the definition of a contracting authority, and social housing organisations are amongst the organisations that meet that definition. And the introduction of the new Act was not intended to disrupt or change the types of organisations that were required to follow the procurement legislations. So social housing organisations fell within the definition of social housing organisations fell within the definition of a contracting authority under the previous procurement legislation, and they still meet that definition now, although now we have one of a number of new terms which refers to contracting authorities as public authorities. But as far as the requirement to follow the legislation is concerned, there's no change in that regard. And this means that individually, social housing organisations were and still are required to follow the rules of procurement legislation and the Procurement Act 2023. Thank you. So whilst we do have a new and single piece of legislation for the award of contracts, it doesn't mean that we have to run out and start procuring new contracts, because the contracts that were awarded under the previous legislation are now invalid, and contracts that were procured under the previous legislation are not affected by the introduction of the Act. Framework agreements that were procured under the Public Contracts Regulations are also unchanged by the introduction of the Act. And for the remainder of their term, they must continue to be managed using the Public Contract Regulations, which is the piece of law that they were procured under originally. So we are still existing with the same legislation that we previously had prior to the 24th of February. But I think the absence of any kind of shortening effect is both important and helpful. And so if your organisation and your repair team relies on a framework agreement for the supply of materials to their team, you are able to continue to use that framework to award contracts until the framework agreement comes to an end. In fact, any framework agreement procured lawfully under the previous legislation remains available to you to procure from until the point that it expires. And additionally, the end of a framework agreement doesn't affect the end date of the contract that you've awarded underneath it. So the Procurement Act just applies to brand new procurements that begin after the 24th of February 2025. Thank you. So having spent almost 2 years preparing for the implementation of the Act, my view is that in some areas it represents a large amount of change, but in other areas the change is really limited to terminology and language, which can actually be complicated enough. What I think the Act has provided is an opportunity for the government to reset and refine objectives for public procurement. So in my experience, the public contracts regulations did concern itself with matters such as the delivery of social value, support, improving the environment and levelling the playing field for small to medium enterprises and local economies. But I don't think the drafting was as obvious or as instructive as it could be. The ability to use procurement to further organisational objectives that are very important to social housing organisations just wasn't as apparent. The previous legislation had a predominant purpose, in fact, which remains the case now, which is to open up government procurement to other member states and to other the country trades with. But it was also used to govern hundreds of thousands of tender processes, and there were times when it really lacked practicality and answers. The Act, albeit largely untested at this point, I think is much more practical and is supported by comprehensive guidance that gives life to some of the more legalistic and dry drafting. Its implementation has been a very well-run exercise on the part of the Cabinet Office, and for over a year now there has been guidance published, the ability to undertake a 10-hour e-learning course, and to complete deep dive courses for senior leaders in the procurement function. So whilst its practical use may highlight teething troubles in the months and years to come, I don't think there's ever been a time, certainly in my career, where there's been more awareness, more interest and enthusiasm in public procurement. And we've seen firsthand here at Procure Plus quite how hard social housing organisations are working to ensure that they understand the Act and that they support the stakeholders across the business in adjusting to the new rules and the new regulations. Like the previous legislation, the Act is also born of our country's commitment to the different trade agreements to which it's a signatory, but it also serves national objectives, which you can see listed on the slide here. And we're told that social housing organisations, when procuring under the Act, must have regard to the delivery of value for money, the maximisation of public benefit, sharing information for the purposes of allowing suppliers and anyone else who's interested to understand procurement policies and decisions, and acting and being seen to act with integrity. And additionally, social housing organisations must have regard to the fact that small to medium enterprises may face barriers to participating, and they must consider whether such barriers can be removed or reduced. These objectives aren't, for the most part, very different to the spirit of the previous legislation, but they are expressed in much clearer language. I think the biggest change amongst those objectives listed is the requirement to share information for the purposes of allowing others to understand procurement policies and decisions. The practical effect of this is that we will, in time, see much more information about procurement in the public domain. I think the requirement to consider small to medium enterprises in procurement processes is particularly worth reflecting upon. Social housing organisations, in a similar way to local authorities and the health sector, are so close to the people and the communities that they serve. They are very close and active within their local economy. I think tender processes, even for lower value contracts, have a level of formality, and they're reflective of an organisation's risk appetite and standing financial instructions. And so consequently, barriers can sometimes be hiding in plain sight within procurement processes. For example, slightly overcomplicated language, disproportionate insurance or experience requirements, or simply too many elaborate questions in the quality area of the tender. And encouraging smaller companies to join tender processes, particularly when they're not very familiar with tendering at all, is as much a change management exercise, I think, as it is a procurement endeavour. So moving on now to look at when the Act applies. So the predominant nature of the contracts awarded in the social housing sector are for general goods, works or services, and the main provisions of the Act apply insofar as the nature of what's being procured isn't exempted by virtue of its inclusion in Schedule 2 of the Act. So there are a list of contracts to which the Act does not apply. But where the whole life value of so insofar as it isn't exempted, where the whole life value of the contract reaches or exceeds the values that are set out on the slide here, is where the main provisions of the Act kick in. The thresholds are increased every 2 years and in accordance with the World Trade Organization and compliance with the Government Procurement Agreement. On a practical level, I would say that the thresholds have to be paired with an understanding of the subject matter of the contract so that you understand that you're working with the correct threshold. As you can see from the values, it's far easier to reach the services threshold than it is to reach the works threshold. And usually the distinction between supplies, services and works is very obvious and easy to make, but it definitely shouldn't be taken for granted. The definition of a works contract has been known to be a matter of debate, and what constitutes a works activity can sometimes be subject to our own individual logic or conventional wisdom that guides us that a particular activity is actually a work rather than the delivery of a service. But it is important to note that works has a separate and clear definition within the Act, and the activities that are deemed as works can be found listed by their CPV code in Schedule 3 of the procurement regulations. So that's just sort of a useful practical tool that's actually quite essential to ensuring that you are complying with the Act, because understanding the correct definition and the threshold means that you'll be able to follow the right procedure. And it's important from a legislative point of view to follow the Act where it applies, but equally, if the main provisions of the Act don't apply and it's a below threshold procurement, then you don't want to encumber your process with too much formality if actually you can get about the business of identifying a competent contractor or supplier without the elaborate procedural processes that sometimes attend above threshold procurements. So very important there. The rules that apply to the procurement of above threshold contracts are extensive, and it wouldn't be practical to go through them all today, and I'm sure you'll be very relieved to hear that. But instead I'll summarise some of the main changes that are brought about by the Act, and they include, firstly, an increase in the publication of information about the procurement and the management of contracts. The Act retains the notices that we previously had, such as the advert to start the procurement and the notice that announced who the successful companies were, but it's introduced a requirement to publish new notices containing information about the management of contracts procured under the Act. For example, for above threshold works contracts and contracts that are above £5 million, key performance indicators, a minimum of 3, will need to be set, and information will then be published about the performance against those KPIs. And at that particular value, the contract itself will also be published. There is a requirement to report instances of breaches of contract when a contract comes to an end, and even when the procurement is terminated before a contract is awarded. And all of this information and more besides will be published on the Find a Tender service, which is sometimes referred to as the Central Digital Platform. There's a reduction in the number of tendering procedures from the 7 that were listed in the public contract regulations, 5 of which were conditional, to 2 procedures. We now have the open procedure, and we have something called a competitive flexible procedure. And this is one that's designed to give social housing organisations as much freedom and flexibility in the design of their tender procedure as they need in order to identify the most advantageous tender. So it can include anything that might be necessary to carry out that evaluation, and both of those procedures are available to any procurement without any conditions that need to be met. And it will be really a discussion with procurement teams as to which procedure, a straightforward open tendering procedure, or something more something longer with dialogue with the bidders, and something more creative that the competitive flexible procedure might afford. The Act also introduces an arrangement called an open framework, and this works very similar to a traditional framework which is retained by the Act, and it's called a closed framework. However, an open framework allows the framework to be opened up multiple times during a maximum term of 8 years, and it's designed to introduce fresh opportunities and fresh competition to a framework that would otherwise be closed to new entrants during its term. And open frameworks have been a matter of debate, really, in terms of, well, what's the point? You may as well do a new tender. And certainly I think that argument is valid in certain circumstances, but as Matt and I have been preparing our company for the Act, we've certainly identified some opportunities where we think open frameworks would at least be worth a try, and have got the opportunity to deliver value. So that's an interesting new tool which everyone and will be looking to make use of in the future. Dynamic purchasing systems have been replaced with a tool called a dynamic market, which works in a very similar fashion. It does have a quirk in the sense that lots of you will be familiar with the term lot, like a lotting structure, and in a dynamic market it's actually called a part instead of a lot. But one of the actual main differences really is that in a dynamic market, every single competition that's held will be advertised in order to invite new companies into that competition, whereas under a dynamic purchasing system there isn't a need there isn't a requirement to advertise each competition that's held, but there will be for dynamic markets that are established under the Act. Thank you, Matt. So we've spoken a little bit there about above threshold procurement, and I just thought that it would be worthwhile touching on procurement that sits beneath the thresholds that were described in the earlier slide. So where procurement and the resulting contract is valued beneath those thresholds, there's much more flexibility in how they can be procured, because the full rigour of the Act just doesn't apply to the procurement process. As you've seen on the previous slide, the threshold for contracts that are defined as works have a higher threshold when compared to services, and we know through our relationships with many different housing providers that below threshold works procurement is very common, particularly amongst repair teams, for example, who may need to procure subcontractors to supplement their repair teams, and also for planned works and works to void properties that can exist in the space between planned and reactive. As a below threshold procurement is not subject to the rules of the Act, there is much more flexibility in designing and running a procurement, and subject to your own standing financial instructions, you may decide not to hold a competition at all, or you may want to seek quotes from known suppliers, or restrict the competition to suppliers who are based locally to you. Thank you. It is worthwhile returning to the subject of thresholds again, because it isn't correct to say that there are no rules that apply to below threshold procurement. There are some. And the Procurement Act introduced a term which is called a notifiable below threshold contract. And this is a contract that is valued at £30,000 and up to the relevant threshold. And there are some rules for the procurement of contracts within those value ranges. Thank you. As mentioned, where the contract is below the threshold, there is the main relevant threshold, there is not a legal obligation to hold a competition. However, where you elect to hold a competition, you have the choice as to whether you advertise the opportunity. It isn't legally necessary to hold a competition, but if in the case of a notifiable below threshold contract, so that's £30,000 up to the relevant threshold, if you decide to hold a competition and you decide to do some advertisement, for example, putting it on your LinkedIn page or your organisational website, then an advert called a below threshold tender notice must first be placed on the Find a Tender portal, as I say, sometimes referred to as a central digital platform. And if a choice to have a competition is made, there are some additional rules to be aware of. So, for example, it isn't permissible to design a tender process so that it has a separate pre-qualification stage. It's definitely possible and actually advisable to proportionately assess matters such as experience and financial health. They're very, very important, but that assessment must be made as a single stage procurement procedure. It wouldn't be lawful to put out a questionnaire with these types of questions in and then use the responses to determine how many of those suppliers who responded should then go on to be invited to tender. And that rule applies unless the procurement of a works contract that has a value of £214,904. So there's some quirks there. The competitions must always be run fairly and provide for the equal treatment of all suppliers. For example, allowing the same amount of time for each supplier to prepare their tender. In below threshold procurement, there remains a duty to consider SMEs and the barriers that they may find in participating and to consider whether those barriers can be removed. And as with all procurements in the public sector, there are implied payment terms of 30 days in below threshold contracts. Notifiable below threshold contracts require what's called a below threshold contract details notice to be published that announces the name of the supplier who's entered into the contract as soon as practicable after entering into that contract. So there must be information in the public domain about who entered into that contract, whether or not a competition was held. Thank you, Matt. So the Act places a lot of emphasis on contract management. Just put that slide back if that's all right, Matt. Thank you. So the Act places a lot of emphasis on contract management, irrespective of the value of the procurement and the contract. And it actually includes the management of a contract in its legal definition of procurement. And much of the information that now needs to be published, which we've touched on earlier today, actually couldn't be collated and published unless the performance of the contract was being managed by the organisation. And we've seen a lot of emphasis within the social housing sector in their preparations about ensuring that there are good relationships between the procurement team and the teams that manage and have the relationship with those companies, because depending on how the organisation arranges itself, it's very common to see those functions sitting in different teams and sitting in different geographies. The Act also includes rules on the extent to which a contract can be changed during its term without it needing to be re-procured. Those particular rules don't apply to a below threshold contract. However, it is really good advice to monitor the ongoing expenditure of a below threshold contract, because if the effect of allocating additional works or services or goods to that supplier increases the overall value of the contract, it may well be that it converts during its lifetime from a below threshold contract to an above threshold contract. And that then makes it a convertible contract, and there are some rules that apply in that circumstance. So spend management and demand management, as always, and even more so going forward, are really helpful and good best practice steps to ensure compliance with the Act. So as you can see, even in the brief overview that I provided, there's an awful lot for procurement teams across the social housing sector to understand and adapt, and I think that is why, quite sensibly, we were all contracting authorities were given such a long time to prepare for the Act, to ensure that we could really understand what it meant for ourselves and for one another and for our supply chains. So finally, on the slide here, I've included some links to the parts of the legislation and guidance that I've mentioned in the slides today, and they'll be available for you to click through and read if you want to get some more information and become more familiar. I will say that I don't think reading the Procurement Act, whilst I enjoy it, and I'm sure there are other people that do, it might not be everyone's idea of fun, but the Cabinet Office have done a really good job of producing individual pieces of guidance that really do make the information accessible and understandable and easy to understand how it would apply. And I think that for those who don't fancy the prospect of sitting down and reading a piece of law, to understand that the guidance exists and to be able to refer to that is just really, really helpful, and something that's useful to be aware of and useful to dip in and out of as and when you need to. So yeah, that comes to the end of my slide. So hopefully that was quite helpful.
Thanks very much, Claire. So as you can see, there's been a lot going on in the procurement sector, very much around these changes to the Act and everyone getting ready and understanding the implications. So hopefully give you a bit of an overview around how that affects direct labour organisations in particular. So now I want to talk a little bit around getting the most out of the market. What are we seeing on the efficiency front? What are we seeing from those 600 call-offs a year that enable us to do better call-offs year on year and getting that innovation into it? So moving through this, and you'll wonder how have I got from a slide on procurement legislation to a nuclear reactor, but all will become apparent shortly. So basically, the starting point when we're doing any of these procurements is, what do you want? And I think we do see a lot of people who constantly go out with the same things that they've been going out for over the last 10, 15 years, particularly around kitchens and stuff like that. So I think the question should always be starting off with that process around what you want. Claire's talked around, so the first point with that is very much around the values. So Claire talked around the thresholds and how the differences you procure about below and above threshold. So you really need to understand what the value of your procurement is before you then start to plan on the different ways of going out to market. And what I would say, we get a lot of questions around when it comes to values. How do you actually value that? And I think there is a big obligation, and there's no guidance around how to value that. But one of the big questions that people ask us, I want to go out for a 3-year contract with a 2+2 extensions to it. So what is the value to that? And the value will always be the full term if you take out those extensions. So don't fall into the trap of putting it as a 3-year and assuming that your value is fine with that. It then includes any extension provisions that you've got in there. But going back to when you're procuring what you want, looking at the history of it, I think we see a lot of people who constantly go back out with the same things, and it changes. The requirements of the works and the service and the materials change as you go along. So look at the history of that. We always talk around, and this is where AI and different ways of analysing data can come in. Look at the history of the data that you've got. Is it something relatively simple like materials, where you can easily identify trends and the numbers of materials you've bought over the last term? Or is it a little bit trickier, where there's a lot of free text fields when it comes to works that operatives have carried out? Is AI something that could come in then and say, well, actually, we've got a lot of free text fields. How do we turn that into a definitive list of what we've done? And I think as we start to get better with that data, we can then start to look at the trends around that. So I'll talk a little bit more, a little bit later on around some of the scenarios, but stuff like damp and mould, when you start to look at the repairs you've carried out to damp and mould, can you identify particular archetypes that have got the same problem? Is it a problem with the way that property is built? Is it a problem with the way people are using that property? Looking at the data and starting to really analyse that can really inform what you're doing and what you're going out to market with. So I think we're seeing more and more people who are really actively doing that and understanding what they want and writing that into the procurement documents. Now, the next two areas is specification, and we still see people going out to market with a specification that was written 20 years ago. Now, a lot has changed around operative efficiency and how you carry out certain repairs, certain investment works, and those specifications should move along all the time. We do a lot of work on specifications in that looking for wriggle room with contractors. You can have specifications that contractors will identify an area that's unclear, and rather than clarifying it as part of their tender, will basically say, well, actually, we know that we've got room for wriggling later on, so let's not highlight that as part of the tender process, and then there's constant discussions as you get into contracts and where that sits. Likewise, I'd also say, so the specifications need to be what you want now from what you are doing and what you've learned over the last few years. And likewise with contracts. So a lot of people will now put schedule amendments to standard forms of contracts in place. And what we see with that is the solicitors write schedule of amendments to be absolutely bulletproof for you as a landlord, which is great until you can't get anyone to sign up to it. And generally what happens with that is a lot of people will be put off from the tender because they can't sign up to it. Claire mentioned insurance levels that aren't available in the marketplace, or various different items within there, indemnity levels. That actually what you need to do is understand whether the market will accept that, because what you'll get back is you'll get people won't sign up and won't put a tender in, or people will ignore it and sign up to it, and then you get disputes later on down the line. And I think the picture of a nuclear reactor is very much don't overcomplicate it. I've seen tender packages put together that hundreds of pages for something that's relatively simple. So don't write a nuclear reactor tender for the sake of fitting in kitchens or bathrooms. Make sure it's fit for purpose and something that the market will react to. So once we've looked at what we want, we can write together and put together a package of what we want. But then you need to make sure that the market is ready for that package that you're putting in place. A lot of times you might put a really, really good set of documents together, but if nobody's really accepting that type of tender or are looking for those types of tender opportunities at the moment, you might not get the returns that you're looking for. So I'd always say, when look at the current market, look at similar tenders. With the find a tender and the publishing that Claire was talking about, that there's going to be much more publishing going on, you'll be able to see how many people are out for market for that particular element at this one particular time, and understand whether that's going to affect how many returns that you get. Carry out expressions of interest. We had a lot with framework contractors that if we've got an opportunity, we'll go and ask people and understand what the appetite for that opportunity is before you then go out to market. Because if you do an expression of interest exercise that takes you a week and it then shows that you're not going to get any returns or any responses, then it's a lot of saved times and you can go back to the drawing board rather than going out to market, spending 4 to 6 weeks at tender and evaluating and understanding you're going to have to collapse that procurement, you're going to have to do something again. And when you're designing it, going back to the last slide, look at the types of organisations you want to engage with. A lot of the stuff, sorry, just looking at questions that came in. A lot of the stuff that people are putting out to market is aimed at a particular type. If you're looking for a small subcontractor to carry out plastering, understand that when you're building the tender and when you're putting the tender together, because that type of organisation will want it to be quite a simple tender, and do you need to put that much into it to get the best out of the market? And then look at how to package it together. If you're identifying the types of organisation and you want a really small SME, then don't package a load of other works into that a really small SME wouldn't be able to cope with. Look at what you're actually trying to deliver and the type of organisation, and then make sure that you put that package together to make sure that you're appealing to the right people at the right times. So moving forward, now, I was looking through the internet for an image of somebody excitedly opening a tender for this one, and funnily enough, I couldn't find anyone excitedly opening a tender. So there's when my AI came in, and I went to an engine and asked for somebody excitedly opening that, and I think you couldn't get anyone more excited with that. And I'm not sure how many tenders are actually labelled as a tender, and actually there's a legal obligation to put them online. But let's forget all that for this and have a look at this particular one. So once we've understood what we want and how to get that out to the market, then you've got to also look at how can I actually source that. So we've talked a lot, and a lot of the procurement that you'll be doing will be below threshold. So actually, if it's below threshold, the requirements are a lot less. And how do you go out to market? Now, what you'll generally find is most of you will have a finance policy or a procurement policy in your governance structure that says how you need to go out to market. So if it is below threshold, there isn't any legal obligations, but you will have organisational obligations that tells you how you need to go out to market. So have a look at those standing orders and make sure you're meeting them. If it is above threshold, there's the opportunity now to go out to the market. So I put that down as a tender, and Claire went through the different ways you can do that, whether that is setting up your own framework, an open framework, a closed framework, a dynamic market. There's lots of options to you that, again, going back to one of my initial points, is governed by the value of the call-off that you're looking to do. So anything now that goes out to market will be governed by the new Procurement Act. So all the stuff that Claire's been talking about will apply to any call-offs that you do. So you'll have to be mindful of that and work with your procurement teams on that. If you do want to use a ready-made framework for your call-offs, that will be governed by the time frame of that original framework. So it will run from when it's said in its original contract notice to when it expires. So although there will be no such thing as a dynamic purchasing system anymore, you will still be able to use dynamic purchasing systems that are already available and already procured until the end of those, when it comes to the end of their term. And likewise with frameworks. And with that, you'll be able to look at your different options with that you can do. Generally, with most frameworks, you can do a direct selection where you identify the most economically advantageous tender based on your individual requirements from their original tender, or you can do a mini competition. Dynamic purchasing systems are slightly different, where you have to always do a competition. There's no such thing as a mini competition because you haven't done a competition when you put that in place. So very much around how could you source that. Now, just bringing back a little bit to the AI discussion. When you're stating how you want to source something, you have to declare how are you going to assess that particular procurement. And this is where we're seeing some interesting AI being brought into it. And what I mean by that is you have to define, am I going to do a pricing document? Am I going to do a qualitative assessment? Am I going to do site visits? And I'm going to do interviews and lots of different, or a combination of those. Now, in our procurements over the last few years, we've done very few interviews because, in essence, it was always very hard to audit how you've scored that interview. And you could have people challenging to say, how did you score me against someone else without that evidence behind it? And I think there's a really good opportunity going forward. The way that these can be recorded as this event is and transcribed will give you that opportunity to use an interview in that way, because that audit trail around what's been said during that interview and how that was marked will be a real opportunity. On the other side of that, written submissions, we're now starting to see more and more AI generated written submissions. Now, we always put into our procurement that you have to declare if you've used an AI engine to help you or to support you with your written submission. So it does give us that way of people actually saying that they've used it. So if they're then going back to something at a later date to say, well, I didn't know what I put in there because it was AI generated, they've stated that it's been AI generated. And I would say at this moment in time, as it is still quite new, it's very easy to spot the AI generated submissions, but it's something to watch out for. So deciding how you're going to procure is very much going to be driven by the technology. And we do think that we'll see a bit of a shift to more interview-based than written submissions. The other bit that me and Claire were talking about is around pricing. Now, pricing traditionally is still very manual, that you've got people pricing every single line item. Will this be something that people are starting to use AI for to put their pricing together? We've already started testing pricing by asking AI engines what's the best price for certain items. So there's lots of interesting bits that might come with the innovation of new technologies and the likes in that particular area. So moving on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some scenarios and what we're seeing from the market. So we're getting a lot of landlords that are asking us around damp and mould procurements. Now, a lot of people obviously, and Awab's law coming in very shortly, is very much around that time frame. How do you identify? How do you understand what's going on? How do you carry out those works very quickly? But we are seeing that a lot of teams, a lot of organisations are putting their own internal teams, and the roundtable that me and Russell sat on a couple of weeks ago very much discussed around how people are addressing that. But we are starting to see quite a few landlords asking to do procurements for it. And what I'd say with that is, it's because of the time frames with it. It isn't to say, I now know what I'm going to be doing. We're seeing a lot of procurements that are looking at schedules of rates for future work. So getting people on board to actually go and carry out major works when it comes to damp and mould, rather than washdowns and the likes, is around full ventilation systems. But we're seeing more and more people looking to go out to market with that. And what they are doing is they're very much looking at the level of information that they're getting from surveys. How are they getting those surveys? Is it purely when people are calling up, identifying issues? How many people are proactively looking to understand those issues? So a lot of organisations are building it into gas servicing surveys, are doing new stock condition surveys with a big area to look at any signs of damp and mould. We've also got people who are looking at it from a data point of view. They're starting to put sensors in. They're starting to look at technologies. We've got technologies that are going in for boilers that are actually built in with sensors on that. So there's a lot around that sort of technology side that people are getting the data from to then proactively go out to market. And again, it's very much then, once you understand what that looks like, testing the market. We've got a lot more contractors who are very dedicated to that now, but the key elements to be put into the procurement are the timeframes around it. It's about understanding what the works are, generating your old schedules of rates for those items, but then ensuring, very similar to a gas servicing contract, around response times and how people will turn that round and have the right teams in place to do that. And the last point is I've already touched on, and some of the really hard to treat areas. Is it the use of technology? We've seen people build into specifications that will carry out the works, but will also then leave technology in there so that we can monitor how effective those measures have been for the longer term. Other people are saying we'll actually schedule in and we'll go and visit every 2 months, every 6 months. So it might be a combination of both. Can you put in the technology to enable you to then restrict having to go back as much because the problem has been solved? Just the last couple of other scenarios, we're seeing a lot of people who are looking at subcontractor requirements, and it's very much around certain elements that need to be picked up. And this follows the same sort of process. Look at the value to start off with as to how you procure it, but then analyse the data. And this is where AI could come in really useful, because there is a lot of free text around those types of requirements for particular types of repairs and particular types of jobs. We're seeing a bit of a combination. Some of the stuff is to top up the works that you're already doing. Others is for specialist subcontractor elements that you will always look to subcontract. But with these types of ones, it is very much around, if it is below threshold and you don't have to go out to the wider market and you're not caught by putting it onto LinkedIn or any of those places, which means you have to deal with it slightly differently, write those procurements in the way to get the response from the market that you'd expect. If you want the really little local suppliers, keep the procurement simple and make sure you package it that works in the way to get the most and be the most efficient that you can be. And the final scenario, I'd say, is very much on the materials front too. Again, have a look at the value. Now, when it comes to material procurements, we tend to find that the values do get higher and that you are really pushing the thresholds to then start to do above threshold procurements. But really look at the data. What we find with a lot of people is they'll get a snapshot of the data over the last 12 months, over the last 2 years, and then use that and throw that out. So get the 80% of the spend from those last 2 years and go back out with that. I think it's a really good opportunity when you're looking at that data to then start to say, well, actually, is that data right for us going forward? Have we had a push where we've done a load of CO2 alarms and that's in that data that we're not actually going to be doing forward? And make sure that you're actually using that to understand what you want and the best way to get that out to the market. And again, don't just go with what you've always done before. We do a lot of options appraisals with different landlords to say, what is the service provision that you currently have? Is it a counter service that you currently get off lots of people? Is it a managed service that you've already got? Is it using multiple service providers? What are you trying to do operationally from an IT point of view? And where does that data go at the moment? And make sure that that is written into your competition so that it's covered off in the right way. And you can make sure you're getting the best out to the market for that. And start to have a look at innovation, but start to understand when it comes to that market engagement. I've put an image there of a drone. There's been a lot of talk of people dropping materials off with drones. Is it there yet? Is it something that you want to put into the tender package? But use that innovation, understand it, and there's no reason why you can't ask that as part of your assessment. Put it into the qualitative. There's areas that we want to be pushing towards. Where are people at with that? Where are the service providers at with that? And I've spoken there at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but I think that comes to the end, Russell. If there's any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Claire. Really good presentation again. And you had as a Procurement Act, and I would ask the question myself, is how well you think the sector's ready for this. I mean, given obviously, well, not obviously, but I sit on a board of a procurement consortium in the Northeast, and I know it's taken us as board members a hell of a lot of time to get heads around it, and probably we're never going to be experts. Just wonder what your view is on where we are from a sectoral point of view. Where are we in terms of understanding?
That's a really good question, Russell. Perhaps it's worth just talking about the communities of practice that you've been sitting on, Claire.
Yeah, so I think, so one of the roles we have here at Procure Plus is that myself and our managing lead, Gwen Beacon, we lead what's called a communities of practice, and it's a sector-based group. Every sector of in the public sector has one where organisations in the same sector come together to support one another in the implementation of the Act. And as a consequence of that, we've established a further network to the one we already have through our relationships to talk specifically about the Act. And my insight from leading that group is that the sector is really characterised by some larger housing associations that have an established team where they'll have, an equivalent of myself leading it and managing, a procurement function across the organisation. And they tend to be the ones that are striding ahead. They're dealing with much more above threshold procurements, and they've had the benefit of the of the previous knowledge of the regulations because they're very familiar with them, and also then the new trainings, so they have a comparator. Where I think the sector has taken, where I think it's difficult for the sector and where I think they perhaps might need additional support going forward is that there's a lot of small housing associations who procure below the threshold and consequently don't have a lot of competence in the previous legislation. So then what they're being faced with is having to learn a new piece of legislation that is much of which doesn't actually apply to them, and the bits that does apply to them, it's having an alarming effect on them because they aren't sure if they've been doing it wrong for years, and if so, what does that mean, or how do they then adapt that into their processes? And that's really where myself and Gwen and our communities of practice have been concentrating on our support, is with the smaller housing associations to just create an environment really where it's okay to say, I don't understand that, what does that mean, and is my organisation in difficulties there, and a safe place to ask those sorts of questions and then give advice and peer support really. And I think that's where I think that the smaller housing associations are the ones that really do need the support, and that's where we've been concentrating our energies, I think.
And I'd say I've spoken to a few of the smaller organisations, and you speak to the chief execs. The question is, do I need to look at this at all? You know, it's off people's radars. Yeah. So I think there's a good network and lots of people are fully on it, but it tends to be the bigger organisations. And I think the smaller ones are asking questions like that at this stage, where it's now, strictly speaking, anything they procure is governed by the new Act. So I think there is a good understanding from a lot of the sector, but when you look at the numbers of small organisations, you know, less than 1,000 properties, I think there's big gaps there.
I think that's where the next leg of work, in fact, we've actually begun that with our recent below threshold event, a big body of work to continue to support the smaller housing associations to understand, you know, whether they need to act with their procurement or not, or what they need, and if so, what does that look like? And they're the ones that really do need the support, because understandably the government have concentrated on preparing everybody for above threshold procurement because it carries the most risk and it's where it's complicated. But I think there hasn't been a great enough recognition at this point of the role that below threshold procurement plays, particularly for housing associations, and that in and of itself can be complicated. I mean, just my own experience, I'm very experienced in public procurement, and I can sometimes really dread having to explain the below threshold procurement rules because they go back, forth, here, there, and something that should be simpler is actually not very intuitive to understand. And so I really do have a lot of compassion and empathy for individuals that work in social housing organisations whose job is not procurement, who then have to grapple with these explanations and these processes. So it's very rewarding to be able to help them, I think.
Brilliant, thanks for that. Anybody on the meeting, on the seminar, that's got any questions for Matt and Claire? There's nothing popped up, Matt. Maybe because lunch was approached, I don't know. But I think if we haven't got any more questions, it just leaves me to say thank you, Matt and Claire. Very, very informative presentation. As usual, Matt, appreciate your input as well. And Claire, thank you very much as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. We are a little bit over, which I've got a problem with. Sorry, go on. Oh, sorry, Matt, you're saying to that?
No, sorry, just said thank you, Russell.
Yeah, so lunch will just extend till 20 to 2, if that's okay then. So instead of coming back 1:30, it'll be 13:40. So we'll catch everybody then, and grab yourself some lunch and a brew, and I'll catch you at 13:40. Thanks so much. Thank you.